the JJ Atkins Art. Thanks for stopping by the channel, and today we're going to be taking a look at a caricature just made for Halloween, Hocus Pocus. Okay, so let's get right into this because we actually have three different caricatures we're talking about today, so we've got a lot to talk about, a lot to unpack in a very short amount of time. Right off the bat, let's establish names here. We have three witches: Winifred, Mary, and Sarah. Winifred is Bette Midler. That's her first caricature here. And, you know, the really interesting thing about doing this piece is that it's obviously very themed around Halloween, but the actresses that went in and played these parts had a lot of makeup, a lot of special effects makeup applied to their faces to make these witch characters. And so in a lot of senses here, we are doing a caricature of a caricature that a makeup artist already took care of for us. Some features were exaggerated on these actresses' faces in order to get this witch character that they were going for. So I'm drawing a caricature of a character that's already been created. So I'm even taking that exaggeration that somebody else has done and taking it to a little bit more of an extreme. Probably the most obvious example of this is in Bette Midler, Winifred's mouth here. The big, huge teeth that were, again, obviously something of a mouthpiece they put in her. And the very unusual way that her lips wrap around those teeth, where she has lipstick on, but only in certain areas of the lips, not on the upper and lower lip, not to the sides. So mouths are very important when trying to capture a resemblance in a caricature, and this thing that the makeup artist did in creating such an unusual mouth for this witch just made my job super easy. So get the mouth straight, make sure you got the eyes somewhat similar to the way they are. Something unusual going on here as well is that Winifred doesn't have any eyebrows. So her heavy eyeshadow creates the hollows of her eyes, but there's no eyebrows to draw or try to capture in this sense. So hair was obviously a big part of this as well, kind of in the loose shape of that, and then I'm moving into my second caricature. Now, I'm going to be brutally honest with you here. This is probably my third or fourth attempt that you're watching right now on trying to capture the Mary witch. The thing about the other two witches is that they were very, very skinny, and so exaggerating their faces is a matter of kind of elongating them and making them even skinnier. And that meant that this Mary character had a wider face. She is a heavier woman. But I didn't really want to make that the caricature. I didn't want to make weight what this was all about. So trying to capture a resemblance in her face without just trying to widen it too much and enhance anything that spoke to her weight was something I was just trying to shy away from. So I made a couple of attempts at it, didn't like what I did, eventually kind of came back to it again, and focused on, I think, a couple things that were really important to her character, which is her mouth. She seems to have this weird jutting out lower lip that the actress is going for there, and also her very wide eyes. She did have a slightly wider face. There was no getting around that, but I really tried to enhance that more in the cheekbones than anything else, and then use the eyes to really kind of hone in on that resemblance that I was going for. Again, this took me a couple attempts, but about fourth or fifth time in, playing around with it, deciding where certain little features should go, like the nose and things like that, I eventually started tying something together. And the whole thing that really kind of helped sell who this is of course the wacky hair. Was again a bit of a mess. It was kind of all over the place. So just kind of sketching in a loose shape of it was a way to kind of approach it, and then trying to create a little bit more of an exaggeration in it later on was just something that was easily approached. So now we get into our last caricature here. This is Sarah Jessica Parker, Sarah. Large stretch of the name there. So the witch's name is Sarah as well. This was, again, a little bit easier for me, this time on my third caricature, so I went through this one pretty quickly. Hair gets sketched in, and we're moving on to the bodies pretty quick, because at this point I was just kind of warmed up and loosened up and, kind of ready to tackle this in earnest. So the Sarah, which will be back in just a second as soon as I establish the bodies and the hands. There were two hands that I wanted to use here. The Winifred character had this really long fingernails and liked to point that one fingernail up to her chin a lot, as I was noticed something like that as I was watching the movie, so I wanted to kind of include that as part of her character. And that's it. I mean, we got a small hand that we'll punch in there really quick for the Mary Witch, and then we're going to get right into our ink work. I did want to do something that was, I don't know, again, I want to come back to that comic book approach again. It's something I'm comfortable with, and I was having a lot of fun with this. This Halloween type stuff is something I really get into, so I wanted to kind of fall back on just a comfortable method for me, which was to get into the inking kind of comic book style coloring. Now, this does going to it's going to make some problems for me a little bit later on. I got pretty far into this when I realized I just really had no plan, no strategy for how I was going to color and render the hair. And really, I'm talking more about the hair for Winifred and the hair for Mary. A lot of curl, a lot of mess, a lot of extraneous strands and things like that. I wasn't sure how realistic I was going to go with it, considering I was also looking for a very simpler comic book style coloring. So how much in depth do you get in the hair? I spent a lot of time fooling around with it and ultimately just kind of left it at a point where I kind of felt satisfied with it. I'm happy with it. I'll leave it at that. But it isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Now, one of the interesting things here is that I've got three characters that are basically, for all intents and purposes, they're kind of standing on top of each other. So there's not a lot of depth I can achieve here, and I don't really want a very complex background either. I'm just going to kind of slap something in really quick that represents just kind of a night sky. Maybe throw in some stars, just kind of get it done quickly. My focus here is obviously on the characters. I want to try to go for some illusion of some sense of three-dimensionality, but there's not going to be a lot of depth in here because these characters are just standing so close to each other. Now, one of the things we're going to get into a little bit later when we get into the coloring phase of this is just doing some of the hiding on the line work. Again, I did want to go with this comic book type style approach, but certain things just didn't ring true to me when I was looking at the line work after some of the colors have been applied. And a great example of this would be Sarah's hair. It's very blonde, almost to the point that it's white. So these black outlines around it really just kind of stuck out like an ugly sore thumb. And so a little bit later back, I went back in and kind of recolored the lines towards the end to make it look almost like it was a highlight of the light shining off the hair or something similar. While we're getting into the coloring here, let's talk a little bit about the flesh tones. Each of these witches, I felt just in my heart of hearts, if you will, should have a slightly different flesh tone. All three of them are Caucasian, obviously, but I did notice that Bette Midler's character, maybe just due to the makeup she was wearing, seemed a little bit redder than the other two. So I went for a very pale complexion on Sarah, went a little bit darker, a little bit more red with Mary, and then by the time I got to Winifred, we got into this almost reddish, pinkish type coloring on her face. And it may seem a little bit extreme right now, but maybe even a little bit too saturated. But once we start getting in the light sources and the shadows and stuff like that, I think you'll find that it will even out a little bit, and it'll start looking a little bit more natural as we get into it. Again, not perfectly natural. This is somebody who's wearing a lot of makeup. That's something I'm trying to portray here. But at least it'll look a little bit more like it's supposed to look. We'll kind of leave it at that. Now, my palette is up in the upper right-hand corner right now. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you're probably pretty familiar with this. But just, for the new people that may have just been starting to look at some of my stuff, the palette, or the several dots that are in the upper right-hand corner, represent what I use anytime I do my shadow and my light layers. So I lay on my midtones, and then I approach shadows with two colors. Because I'm working in a certain way, I've decided that my light source here is going to be kind of a warm light. I want something that's kind of in a yellowish kind of category. It may not necessarily make that much sense considering we're kind of, setting this in a night sky and everything like that, but it's something I'm going to run with, so just kind of bear with me. So again, we're using warm lights, and that means cool shadows as an opposite. So when I'm approaching my cool shadows, I go into my little color picker there, and I pick a color that's more on the blue side, but very heavily desaturated and almost gray. There's a hint of blue there, but not much. It's more gray than anything else. Then I'll pick a color similar to that that's just a little bit darker. So again, just about that same amount of blue, very desaturated, very little of it, but going down the scale more towards the blackish sort of gray, but not going full black. So that represents the two darker colors that you see on the left-hand side of my palette. And when I use those colors, I use them on a multiply layer. So when I set up a layer to put over top of my midtones, I set that layer to a blend mode called multiply. And what that allows to happen here is that when I pick up that blue color, that one all the way on the left, and I paint it over anything, it creates an automatic translucent type shadow over it. So in other words, I'm painting a bluish gray over something, but because of the multiply blend mode put onto the layer, it pulls up some of the color from underneath. So if I'm painting this on orange, some of the orange will come up from underneath, blend with that blue, and make an appropriate shadow color. It takes that tone of the mid-tone that's underneath of it and helps add into it to create an appropriate shadow tone. It's just kind of an interesting little trick. That does lay in a relatively light shadow, though. Sometimes you want some deeper shadows, and that's why I had that darker version of blue-gray. The opposite can also be said of my light colors, my three colors that are yellow, kind of whitish yellow, and then almost pure white. These are my light colors. I'm going to use them in the same way I use my shadow colors, pick them out as I need them depending on how bright I need to go. And when I paint them in on a blend layer, and that blend layer is set to hard light. Sometimes I vary that up a little bit. It might be a linear light or a overlay. Hard light usually does it for me, but occasionally I might tweak that and just kind of see what works best for the tone or for the mood I'm trying to kind of create in the piece that I'm working on. But that's really kind of about all the tricks that I have when it comes to shadow and light. There's certainly some things you want to do to kind of consider how hard-edged you want your shadows or lights, or whether or not you want to kind of blend something with a blur or an airbrush. Those are all brush techniques, but from a sheer color standpoint, those 5 colors make up anything that I do with shadows and light. And this is a trick that I repeat in just about every piece that I ever do. So if you've heard me talk about this before, this is me just kind of repeating it all over again, because I think it's a pretty worthy trick. Now, I mentioned before that I did struggle here a little bit with the hair, so we're going to watch me mess around with the hair here for a little bit. At the end of the day, again, I didn't come into this with a real strategy other than just understanding that I wanted to create some idea that there was some three-dimensional depth to this, that there was shadow, that the hair towards her skull did recede in the back and go behind her head as well, so there had to be some shadow in there. And that shadow has texture because of all the curls that are in there. I didn't really have any ability to match what I was seeing in any of the reference photographs. They were big, large curls. Every photograph had a messy set of curls that looked completely different to me from every single angle. So I basically just tried to go with something that was loosely the shape of what they were intending when they made this wig for the movie. But again, I kind of just try to stylistically put it in without trying to get every single strand and every little curl in. This same kind of approach was also taken with Mary. Mary's got something of a bird's nest of hair scattered all over the place on top of her head. It looks like it's just a loose collection of knots that happens to form a particular shape. So and not to mention the fact that it's black hair too, so it doesn't reflect a lot of light, especially in this kind of dark environment I put them in. So how much detail can I really add and still have it look at least sensible on the page, semi-realistic? So I opted here at the end of the day just to put in a couple of highlights to kind of say that there was a little bit of light reflecting off of it, but there wasn't much to see there. That's more black than anything else. And part of that is kind of helped by the fact she's actually sitting or standing slightly behind Winifred. So Winifred's big head of hair there is blocking a lot of the light that might be able to shine off Mary's hair otherwise. So you can see me kind of painting in some of the purple reflections of light there right now, but I'm really going to kind of rub them and smudge them and stuff like that, and then really kind of desaturate them, kind of blend them out quite a bit, so it's really just kind of a hint of that color and not much else. Again, you'll see me trying to enhance a little bit, and then I'll smudge a little bit. It becomes desaturated. I'll go back in with a slightly brighter layer, smudge that a little bit, until I finally think that it's subtle enough that it's barely there, but it's in place enough that we can definitely see something, that it means something on the page. Again, there's a lot of also crazy little strands coming off all over the place, so I try to add some detail in there as well as best I could. And then just a little bit of a change of the line color here, as I mentioned before, just to kind of eliminate some of the black bold outlines and give it, again, some sense of some light kind of maybe even shining behind them a little bit. That light source, again, I decided to kind of be purple. There was a lot of purple tones and red tones kind of going on throughout this piece, so it just kind of seemed to match up as a good light source. And it really kind of, by changing the line color to this purplish color, it really kind of gives it almost a sense of rim lighting, which kind of works out. And again, really kind of helps enhance the hair for the Sarah character all the way on the right. So I'm bringing in the palette back right now just to kind of do a little bit of touch-up work, mostly with the detail on the costume there. And that's it. We're about done with this piece. So you'll see my signature going in just a second. And at this point, I'm just going to ask you to take a second, click on that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. I got more Halloween stuff coming soon. Stay tuned, and I hope to see you again. Thanks, everybody.